The Cage, Chapter 22 of Shardik by Richard Adams. Throughout the latter part of the night, and on into the dawn that appeared at last, grey and muffled, behind the clouds piled in the east, Baltus and his men slowly hauled the cage above the forests of the Teltherna. Behind and below them, the miles of treetops, that secluded, shining haunt of great butterflies, appeared, like waves seen from a cliff-top, to be creeping stealthily downwind. Far off, the line of the river shone in the cloudy light with a glint dull as a sword's, the blackened north bank dim in the horizon haze. The bear lay inert, as though dead. Its eyes remained closed, the dry tongue protruded, and with the jolting of the boards the head shook as a block of stone vibrates on the quarry floor at the thudding of the rocky masses falling about it. Some of the dusty, footsore girls clung to the ramshackle structure to steady it as it went, while others walked ahead, removing stones from the track or filling ruts and holes before the wheels reached them. Behind the cage plodded Sencred, the wheelwright, watching for the beginnings of play in the wheels or sagging in the axle trees, and from time to time calling up the rope lines for a halt while he checked the pins. Kelderek took his turn at the ropes with the others, but when at length they stopped to rest, the girls pushing heavy stones for blocks behind the wheels, he and Baltus left the men and walked back to where Sencred and Zilphi stood leaning against the cage. Zilphi had thrust her arm through the bars and was caressing one of the bear's forepaws with its curved sheaf of claws longer than her own hand. "Waken, waken to destroy Bekla. Waken, Lord Shardik, Nakora, Naro," she sang softly, rubbing her sweating forehead against the cool iron. Full of sudden misgiving, Kelderek stared at the bear's corpse-like stillness. There seemed not the least swell of breathing in the flank, and the flies were settling about the ears and muzzle. "What is this drug? Are you sure it has not killed him?" "He is not dead, my lord," said Zilphi, smiling. "See." She drew her knife, bent forward, and held it under Shardik's nostrils. The blade clouded very slightly and cleared. Clouded and cleared once more. She drew it back and held the flat, warm and moist, against Kelderek's wrist. "Peltokarna is powerful, my lord, but she who is dead knew, none better, how it should be used. He will not die." "When will he wake?" "Perhaps this evening, or during the night. I cannot tell. For many creatures we know the dose and the effect, but his body is like that of no other creature, and we can only guess." "Will he eat, then? Drink?" "Creatures that wake from Peltokarna are always dangerous. Often there is a frenzy, more violent than that before the trance, and then the creature will attack anything that it encounters. I have seen a stag break a rope as thick as one of these bars, and then kill 2 oxen. "When?" asked Kelderek wonderingly. She began to tell him of Kiso and of the sacred rites of the spring equinox, but Baltus interrupted her. "If what you're saying's true, then those bars won't hold him." "The roof's not stout enough to hold him either," said Sencred. "He's only got to stand upright, and he'll smash like a pie crust." "We've been wasting our time," said Baltus, spitting in the dust. "He might as well not be the other side of those bars at all. He'll get up and go when he wants. But I'll tell you this, I'll go first." "We shall have to drug him again, then," said Kelderek. "That would certainly kill him, my lord," put in Sheldra. "Feltokarna is a poison. It cannot be used twice. No, not twice in 10 days. There was a murmur of agreement from the other girls. "Where is the Tuginda?" asked Nito. "Is she with Lord Takominian? She would know what to do." Kelderek made no answer, but, walking back up the track, began getting the men to their feet again. An hour later, the going became easier as the ascent flattened off and the road grew less steep. As near as he could judge from the confused, murky sky, it was about noon when at last they came into Gelt. The square was littered as though after a riot. There was scarcely a living creature to be seen, but a smouldering reek hung in the air and the smell of garbage and order. A solitary, ragged urchin loitered, watching them from a safe distance. "Smells like a herd of bloody apes," muttered Baltus. "Tell your men to eat and rest," said Kelderek. "I'll try to find out how long the army's been gone." He crossed the square and stood looking about him in perplexity at the shut doors and empty alleys beyond. Suddenly he felt a sharp momentary pain, like the sting of an insect, in the lobe of his left ear. He put his hand to the place and drew it away with blood between finger and thumb, and in the same instant realized that the arrow that had grazed him was sticking in the doorpost across the way. He spun round quickly, but saw only another deserted lane running between closed doors and shuttered windows. Without turning his head, he stepped slowly backwards into the square and remained watching the blank, silent hovels for any sign of movement. "What's up?" asked Baltus, coming up behind him. Kelderek touched his ear again and held out his fingers. Baltus whistled. "That's nasty," he said. "Throwing stones, eh?" "An arrow," said Kelderek, nodding at the doorpost. Baltus whistled again. At that moment, with a grating sound upon the threshold, a nearby door opened, and a bleary, dirty old woman appeared. She was hobbling and staggering beneath the weight of a child in her arms. As she came nearer, Kelderek saw with a start that it was dead. The old woman tottered up to him and laid the child on the ground at his feet. It was a girl, about 8 years old, blood matted in her hair, and a conjunctive yellow discharge round the open eyes. The old woman, bent and muttering, remained silent before him. "What do you want, grandmother?" asked Kelderek. "What's happened?" The old woman looked up at him from eyes bloodshot with years of crouching over wooden fires. "Think no one sees. They think no one sees," she whispered. "But God sees. God sees everything." "What happened?" asked Kelderek again, stepping over the child's body and grasping the stick-thin wrist between the rags. "Aye, that's right. Better ask them. Ask them what happened," said the old woman. "You'll catch 'em if you're quick. They're not gone far. They're not gone long." At this moment 2 men came striding side by side round the corner. They kept their eyes fixed before them, and their faces bore the tense, resolute expression of those who knowingly run a risk. Without speaking to Kelderek, they grasped the old woman's arms and began leading her away between them. For a moment she struggled, protesting shrilly. "It's the governor-man from Bekla. The governor-man. I'm telling him." "Now you just come along, mother," said one of the men. "Just come along with us now. You don't want to be standing about here. Come along now." They shut the door behind them, and a moment later came the sound of a heavy bar falling into place. Kelderek and Baltus left the child's body on the ground and returned across the square. The men had formed a ring round the girls and were looking nervously about. "I don't think we ought to stop here," said Sincred, pointing. "There's not enough of us to make it safe." A crowd of men had gathered at the far end of a lane leading off the square, talking and gesticulating among themselves. A few were carrying weapons. Kelderek took off his belt, laid his bow and quiver on the ground, and walked towards them. "Careful," called Baltus after him. Kelderek ignored him and walked on until he was 30 paces from the men. Holding his hands open on either side of him, he called, "We don't want to hurt you. We're your friends." There was a burst of jeering laughter, and then a big man with grey hair and a broken nose stepped forward and answered, "You've done enough. Let us alone or we'll kill you." Kelderek felt less afraid than exasperated. "Try and kill us then, you fools," he shouted. "Try it." "Ah, and have his friends come back," said another man. "Why don't you go and catch your friends up? They've not been gone an hour." "I'd say take his advice," said Baltus, who had approached and was standing at Kelderek's shoulder. "No point in waiting till they work themselves up to rush us." "But our people are tired," answered Kelderek angrily. "They'll be worse than that, my boy, if we don't get out of here," said Baltus. "Come now, I'm no coward, and neither of those lads of mine, but there's nothing to be gained by staying." Then, as Kelderek still hesitated, he called out to the men, "Show us the way, then, and we'll go." At this, like a pack of pie-dogs, they all took a few wary steps forward, and then began shouting and pointing southwards. As soon as he was sure of the way, Kelderek drew a line in the dust with his foot and warned them not to cross it until the Ortelgans were gone. "Aye, we can leave Gelt without any help from you," shouted Baltus, laying hold of the ropes once more to encourage his weary men. They plodded slowly away, the townspeople staring after them, chattering together and pointing at the huge brown body stretched behind the bars. Outside the town, the road fell away downhill. Soon it became so steep that their task was no longer to drag the cage after them, but rather to control its downward course. Coming to a broad, level place above a long slope, they turned it about and took the strain on the ropes from behind. At least the ground, dry and gritty, gave good foothold, and for a time they made better speed than during the morning. A mile or two below, however, the road narrowed and began to wind along the rocky side of a ravine, and here they were forced to let the cage down foot by foot, straining backwards, while Sencred and 2 or 3 of his men used poles to lever the front wheels this way and that. At one place, where the bend was too sharp, they had to set to work to broaden the track, prizing out the rocks with hammers, iron bars, and whatever came to hand, until at last they were able to shift an entire boulder and send it plummeting over the edge into long seconds of silence. Further on, 2 of the men slipped, and the rest, cursing and terrified, were jerked forward and nearly pulled off their feet. Not long after this, Kelderek saw that play had increased in the wheels, and that the whole structure had shifted and was no longer true on the frame. He consulted Baltus. "It's not worth trying to right it," answered the smith. "The truth is, another hour or 2 of this is going to shake the whole thing to pieces. The frame's been ground like corn, do you see, between the road below and the weight of the bear above. Even careful work couldn't stand up to that forever, and this lot had to be done quick, like the loose girl's wedding. So what do you want, young fellow? Are we going on?" "What else?" replied Kelderek. And indeed, for all their hardship and near exhaustion, not one of the men had complained or tried to argue against their going on to overtake the army. But when at last they had done with the precipices and the steep pitches, and were resting at a place where the road broadened and entered an open wood, he allowed himself for the first time to wonder how the business would end. Apart from the girls, who were initiates of a mystery, and in any case would never question anything he told them to do, no one with him had any experience of the strength and savagery that Shardik could put forth. If he were to waken in the midst of the Ortelgan army, and burst raging out of the flimsy cage, how many would be slaughtered? And how many more through this would become convinced of his anger and disfavour towards Ortelga? Yet if Baltus and the rest, for their own safety, were told to abandon Shardik now, what could he himself say to Takominian, who had sent word that Shardik must be brought at all costs? He decided to press on until they were close behind the army. Then, if Shardik were still unconscious, he would go forward, report to Takominian, and obtain further orders. But now it became a matter of finding men with enough strength left to pull on the ropes. After the past 12 hours, some were scarcely able to put one foot before the other. Yet, even in this extremity, their passionate belief in the destiny of Shardik drove them to stumble, to stagger, to hobble on. Others, in the very act of pulling, fell down, rolling out of the track of the wheels, and gasping to their companions to give them a hand. Some set themselves to push behind the cage, but as soon as it gathered a little speed, fell forward and measured their length on the road. Sencred cut himself a forked crutch and limped on beside his splayed wheels. Their pace was that of an old man creeping the street, yet still they moved, as a thaw moves up a valley, or flood-water mounts in minute jerks to burst its banks at last and pour over the land. Many, like Zilthi, put their arms through the bars to touch Lord Shardik, believing and feeling themselves strengthened by his incarnate power. Into this bad dream fell the rain, mingling with sweat, trickling salty over puffed lips, stinging open blisters, hissing through the leaves, quenching the dust in the air. Baltus lifted his head to the sky, missed his footing with the effort, and stumbled against Kelderek. "Rain," he grunted. "The rain, lad. What's to be done now?" "What?" mumbled Kelderek, blinking as though the smith had woken him. "The rain, I says, the rain. What's to become of us now?" "God knows," answered Kelderek. "Go on, just go on." "Well, but they can't fight their way to Bekla in the rain. Why not go back while we can? Save our lives, eh?" "No!" cried Kelderek passionately. "No!" Baltus grunted and said no more. Many times they ground to a stop, and as many times found themselves moving again. Once Kelderek tried to count their lessening numbers, but gave up in confusion. Sencred was nowhere to be seen. Of the girls, Nito was missing, Mooney, and 2 or 3 more. Those who were left still kept beside the cage, daubed from head to foot with rainy mud churned up by the wheels. The light was failing. In less than an hour it would be dark. There was no sign of the army, and Keldrek realized with desperation that in all probability his band of fireless stragglers would be forced to spend the night in the wilderness of these foothills. He would not be able to keep them together. Before morning they would be shivering, sick, mutinous, victims of panic fear. And before morning, if Zilphy were right, Shardik would awaken. Baltus came up beside him again. "It's a bad lookout, you know, young fellow," he said between his teeth. "We'll have to stop soon. It'll be dark. And what's to be done then? You and I'd better go on alone, find the young Baron, and ask him to send back help. But if you ask me, he'll have to come back out of it himself if he wants to stay alive. You know what the rains are. After 2 days a rat can hardly move, let alone men." "Hark!" said Keldrek. "What's that noise?" They had come to the top of a long slope, where the road curved downhill through thick woodland. The men on the ropes stood still, 1 or 2 sinking down in the mud to rest. At first there seemed to be no sound except all about them the pouring of the rain in the leaves. Then, faintly, there came again to Keldrek's ears the noise he had heard at first, distant shouting, sharp and momentary as flying sparks, voices confusing and overlaying one another like ripples on a pool. He looked from one man to the next. All were staring back at him, waiting for him to confirm their single thought. "The army!" cried Keldrek. "Aye, but what's the shouting for?" said Baltus. "Sounds like trouble to me." Sheldra ran forward and laid her hand on Keldrek's arm. "My lord," she cried, pointing. "Look, Lord Shardik is waking." Keldrek turned towards the cage. The bear, its eyes still closed, was haunched on the rickety floor in an unnatural crouching position, suggesting not sleep, but rather the grotesque posture of some gigantic insect, the back arched, the legs drawn up together under the body. Its breathing was uneven and labored, and froth had gathered at its mouth. As they watched, it stirred uneasily, and then, with an uncertain, stupefied groping, raised one paw to its muzzle. For a moment its head lifted, the lips curling as though in a snarl, and then sank again to the floor. "Will he wake now, at once?" asked Shardik, shrinking involuntarily as the bear moved once more. "Not at once, my lord," answered Sheldra, "but soon, within the hour." The bear rolled on its side. The bars clattered like nails on a bench, and the near-side wheels lurched, splaying under the massive weight. The sounds of battle were plain now, and through the shouting of the Ortelgans they could discern a rhythmic, intermittent cry, a concerted sound, hard and compact like a missile. "Bekla moat! Bekla moat!" "Press on!" shouted Keldrek, hardly knowing what he said. "Press on! Shardik to the battle! Take the strain behind, and press on!" Fumbling and stumbling in the rain, they unfastened the wet ropes, hitched them to the other end of the rickety bars, and pushed the cage forward down the slope, checking it as it gathered momentum. They had gone only a short distance when Keldrek realized that they were closer to the battle than he had supposed. The whole army must be engaged, for the din extended a long way to right and left. He ran a short distance ahead, but could see nothing for the thick trees and failing light. Suddenly a little knot of 5 or 6 men came running up the hill, looking back over their shoulders. Only 2 were carrying weapons. One, a red-haired, raw-boned fellow, was ahead of the others. Recognizing him, Keldrek grabbed his arm. The man gave a cry of pain, cursed, and aimed a clumsy blow at him. Keldrek let go and wiped his bloody hand on his thigh. "Numis," he shouted, "what's happened?" "It's all up, that's what's happened. The whole Becklin army's down there, thousands of them. Get out of it while you can." Keldrek took him by the throat. "Where's Lord Tuckleminion, you? Where?" Numis pointed. "There, lying in the bloody road. He's a goner." And he wrenched himself free and vanished. The cage, following down the hill, was now close behind Keldrek. He called to Baltus. "Wait, hold it there till I come back." "Can't be done, it's too steep," shouted Baltus. "Wedge it, then," answered Keldrek over his shoulder. "Tuckleminion's here." "Too steep, I tell you, lad, it's too steep." Running down the hill, Keldrek glimpsed beyond the trees a rising slope of open, stony ground, over which ortelgans were streaming back towards him. From further away, steady as a drumbeat, came the concerted shouts of the enemy. He had not gone half a bowshot before he saw his man. Takominian was lying on his back in the road. The downhill flow of rain, with its flotsam of twigs and leaves, was dammed against his body as though beneath a log. Beside him, chafing his hands, crouched a tall, grey-haired man, Kvass the Fletcher. Suddenly, Takominian screamed some incoherent words and tore at his own arm. Keldrek ran up and knelt over him, his gorge rising at the smell of gangrene and putrefaction. "Zelda!" cried Takominian. His white face was horribly convulsed, its shape that of the skull beneath, and only more ghastly for the life that flickered in the eyes. He stared up at Keldrek, but said nothing more. "My lord," said Keldrek, "what you required has been done. Lord Shardik is here." Takominian uttered a sound like that of a mother beside a fretful child, like that of the rain in the trees. For an instant, Keldrek thought that he was whispering him to silence. Shardik! Shardik has come, my lord." Suddenly, a snarling roar, louder even than the surrounding din of battle, filled the tunnel-like roadway under the trees. There followed a clanging and clattering of iron, sharp cracks of snapped wood, panic cries, and a noise of dragging and scraping. Baltus's voice shouted, "Let go, you fools!" Then again broke out the snarling, full of savagery and ferocious rage. Keldrek leapt to his feet. The cage had broken loose and was rushing down the hill, swaying and jumping as the crude wheels ploughed ruts in the mud and struck against protruding stones. The roof had split apart, and the bars were hanging outwards, some trailing along the ground, others lashing sideways like giants' flails. Shardik was standing upright, surrounded by long white splinters of wood. Blood was running down one shoulder, and he foamed at the mouth, beating the iron bars about him as Baltus's hammers had never beaten them. The point of a sharp, splintered stake had pierced his neck, and as it swayed up and down, levering itself in the wound, he roared with pain and anger. Red-eyed, frothing and bloody, his head smashing through the flimsy lower branches of the trees overhanging the track, he rode down upon the battle like some beast god of apocalypse. Just in time, Keldrek threw himself against the bank. Spongy and sodden, it gave way beneath his weight, and he sank backwards into the mud. The cage thundered past him, grinding over the very spot where he had been kneeling, and the 3 near side wheels, each as thick as a man's arm, passed across Takominian's body, crushing a bloody channel through clothing, flesh, and bone. Still further it went, driving through the Ortelgan fugitives like a demon's chariot until, striking head-on against a tree trunk, it tilted forward and smashed to pieces. For a few moments Shardik, thrown upon his back, thrashed and struggled for a footing. Then he stood up, and, with the point of the stake still embedded in his neck, burst through the trees and on to the battlefield.